The words left my mouth before I could stop them, and honestly, I didn't want to. I'll be countersuing for the full amount owed to me, filing for sole custody of our daughter, and your client can keep every debt he's already buried himself under. All of it. The conference room at the family law office went completely still. My husband's attorney, a broad-shouldered man in a charcoal suit who had been speaking over me for the better part of an hour, stopped mid-sentence. His pen hovered above his pad. Across the mahogany table, my husband, Sawyer, uncrossed and recrossed his legs, and finally, for the first time since we'd walked in together, looked directly at me. There was no guilt in his face. There was surprise, which told me everything I needed to know about how little he'd been paying attention for 4 years. I was 32 years old, a licensed CPA with a decade of meticulous work behind me, and I had spent the last 4 years of my marriage quietly funding a family that never once acknowledged it. And the morning I sat in that conference room and finally stopped being quiet, it was the first morning in a long time that I didn't feel tired. I met Sawyer at a mutual friend's birthday dinner 6 years ago. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, not flashy, but warm. He listened well. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered that I took my coffee black and that I'd mentioned wanting to visit Portugal someday, and 2 weeks into dating, he sent me an article about the Alentejo wine region with no message attached, just a small star emoji at the top. I thought that was the most thoughtful thing a man had ever done for me. His family was old money in the way that sometimes means new problems. They owned a small commercial real estate development company his father had started in the 80s. Strip mall conversions, light industrial leasing, nothing glamorous, but profitable enough that the family lived well. A large house in a gated community outside the city. 2 nice cars. His mother always impeccably dressed. His father on a first-name basis with the mayor at every Chamber of Commerce dinner. When Sawyer introduced me to them, his mother smiled warmly and said she was glad he'd found someone grounded. I learned later that grounded meant she was glad he'd found someone with a reliable income, because Sawyer's finances had been held together with the family's money for longer than anyone admitted. I didn't know that then. I just thought she was being kind. We got married 18 months after we met, small ceremony in the Berkshires. My parents were there, his entire extended family was there. It was a beautiful day. Sawyer cried a little when I walked toward him, and I remember thinking, this is the person I'm going to build something real with. The first time his father asked me to take a look at the company's quarterly books, it was framed as a favor between family. I was a CPA. Why would they pay an outside firm when they had me? I stayed up until midnight that Friday going through 3 years of disorganized records, flagged 11 items that could have triggered an audit, and reorganized their filing system while I was at it. His mother sent me flowers the next day with a note, "We're so lucky to have you in this family." That was year 1. By year 2, I was doing their annual tax filings. By year 3, I had co-signed on a business line of credit because the bank required a second signature and my credit score was cleaner. I told myself it made sense. We were a family. Families share responsibility. What I didn't tell myself, because I wasn't ready to hear it, was that my husband had stopped contributing to our household expenses 8 months earlier and had started calling every request for help a temporary problem. The business didn't get better. The requests did. His mother needed a new HVAC system. His father had co-signed a loan for an old friend, and the friend had defaulted. His sister's husband was laid off, and their 2 kids were in private school. Could we cover tuition this semester, just until things stabilized? Every time I hesitated, someone in that family would say some version of the same sentence. You're part of this family now. That's what family does. I believed them, or I wanted to. Those 2 things are different, but when you love someone, you don't always stop to check which one you're doing. Our daughter, Josie, was born at the end of year 2. She came into the world smalls and furious and absolutely certain she had opinions, which made me love her completely and immediately. I had hoped a baby would settle something in Sawyer. I'd heard that fatherhood shifts a man's center of gravity. What I saw instead was that he became more social, not less. More client dinners, more weekend trips for networking, more late nights where I sat up with a baby on my chest and a phone that didn't ring. One evening when Josie was 14 months old, I was going through the dry cleaning I'd just picked up. Sawyer was traveling. He'd asked me to grab it. And I found a receipt in the breast pocket of his blazer. A receipt from a jewelry store in Charleston, South Carolina, for a bracelet, $1,400. I had never been to Charleston. I do not own a bracelet from that store. I stood in the laundry room for a long time holding that piece of paper. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of my own work bag. I didn't say a word to anyone. I'm a CPA. Numbers do not lie, they don't deflect, and they don't tell you you're being paranoid when you ask a direct question. So I went back to the numbers. It took me 3 weeks of careful, quiet digging. I had access to the business accounts because I'd been doing their books for 2 years. What I found was a pattern of payments. Monthly, consistent, logged as contractor fees and client development expenses. Going to an LLC I had never seen referenced in any real transaction. I pulled the state business registry. The LLC had been registered 8 months earlier by a woman named Demi. A brief search told me she was 25, a part-time yoga instructor, living in a midtown apartment leased under that exact LLC. Sawyer was paying her rent. For 8 months. Out of the family business account. Out of the account connected to the line of credit I had co-signed. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a while. Not because I was surprised anymore. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks I had moved past surprise. But because I was running math, I didn't want to run. How much of what I'd put in had quietly funneled outward? How much of the temporary cash flow problems had actually been Sawyer maintaining a second life he'd decided he was entitled to? The number I arrived at, conservatively, made my hands clench. I didn't go to Sawyer. I went to a therapist first because I needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't connected to his family. Then I called an attorney, a woman named Ms. Aldrin, who had been recommended by a former colleague who called her the most thorough family law litigator in the city, particularly in cases involving financial fraud. When I laid everything on her desk, she looked up after a few minutes and asked how long I'd been keeping records this organized. Since I married into an accountant's nightmare, I said. She smiled. Good, we have a great deal to work with. We hadn't filed anything yet when Demi contacted me. I don't know how she found my personal email. Her subject line was just, I think we need to talk. I almost deleted it. Instead, I sat with it for an hour, then wrote back, when and where. We met at a coffee shop near the hospital. She arrived looking nothing like the person I'd mentally assembled from the information I had. She was quieter than I'd expected. She sat with both hands around her mug and didn't try to justify anything. She just looked at me and said, I didn't know he was actually still married. He told me you two had been separated for 2 years. He said you were only in the same house for your daughter's sake. We were not separated, I said. I know that now. She bit her lip. He showed me pictures of a spare bedroom. He said it was his room. He said you'd both moved on. There was a particular kind of tired in her voice that I recognized. The kind that comes from having believed something completely, and then watching that belief get quietly dismantled. Why come to me? I asked. She reached into her bag and slid a manila envelope across the table. Because 3 weeks ago, he asked me to hold on to some documents. He said they were business papers his father didn't want, kept at the office temporarily. He said he'd pick them up in a few days. She paused. He never came back for them. And when I looked at what was inside, I knew I couldn't just sit on it. Inside the envelope were copies of 3 loan documents filed with a private lender. Each one had a signature line for an authorized financial representative. Each one bore my name, my professional credentials, my CPA license number, in a signature that was not mine. I sat very still. Someone in that family had used my professional identity to authenticate loan documents I had never seen or authorized. If those loans defaulted, and given what I now knew about their real financial position, I could be pulled into a fraud investigation. "Thank you for bringing this to me," I said. "I'm not doing it for you," she replied, not unkindly. "I'm doing it because I won't be part of whatever they're trying to do." I asked her several specific questions. She answered every one without hesitation. Before we left, I told her she should get her own attorney. She nodded like she'd already been thinking about it. I called Ms. Aldrin from the parking lot and told her we needed to move faster than planned. The weeks that followed were the kind that age you in ways that don't show up until later. His family had figured out I wasn't going to step aside quietly, and they responded the way families do when cornered. Not honestly, but carefully. His mother started calling Josie's preschool. She introduced herself as the child's primary grandmother and expressed concern, in very measured language, about my work schedule and the stress I'd reportedly been under. The school director called to let me know. I thanked her, updated the pickup authorization form on the spot, and made sure only my name and my sister's name remained on the approved list. Then came the certified letter from the state licensing board. An anonymous complaint alleged that I had participated in the falsification of financial documents and that my professional conduct required investigation. I read it in my car, in the parking garage, and sat with it for a long time. He had come for my license, the one thing I had built entirely on my own, the one part of my life that had never belonged to anyone but me. The licensing board hearing was formal and uncomfortable. I came with Miss Aldrin and a second attorney who specialized in professional credentialing cases. I presented the original loan documents and a forensic handwriting analysis, along with bank records placing me in another state. On 2 of the 3 dates the documents were notarized. The board reviewed everything. 3 weeks later, the complaint was dismissed. No grounds for disciplinary action. But when I got home that evening, I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, just because that's where my legs gave out, and cried for a while. Not from relief, from the exhaustion of having had to defend my entire professional life against accusations built entirely from my husband's choices. Then I got up, changed into comfortable clothes, and went to pick up Josie from my sister's house. The preliminary custody hearing was on a Tuesday in October. His mother wore dove gray and looked like a woman who chaired a nonprofit. His father wore the expression of a man who had never been told no by anyone with a gavel. Sawyer looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. The kind of tired that comes not from work but from consequence. Their attorney argued that I was career-focused, frequently traveling, and that Josie would thrive in a stable, multi-generational home with consistent adult supervision. It sounded reasonable from the outside. It would have sounded reasonable to me, once, if I hadn't been the one who knew my daughter was allergic to tree nuts, who had attended every pediatric appointment, who had listed as primary contact at the preschool because I was the parent who answered the phone. Miss Aldrin asked Sawyer, under oath, when Josie had last been to the pediatrician and what the visit was for. He said he wasn't certain. She asked about the last parent-teacher conference. He thought it was sometime in the spring. She asked about food allergies. He paused for 3 full seconds. "She's allergic to tree nuts," I said from my seat, and the judge looked up from his notes. Miss Aldrin presented the school's pickup records, the emergency contact forms. 4 years of documentation showing who had shown up, who had called, who had known. Then she called Mr. Poole. He had worked as a bookkeeper for Sawyer's family business for 11 years. He'd left after going 3 months without pay, which in itself told you something about how far things had fallen. He was a quiet, precise man in his early 60s who had clearly rehearsed nothing, and for that reason was completely believable. He testified to the pattern of financial mismanagement he'd documented. He testified that he had been asked to log personal expenses, including recurring payments to an LLC he couldn't trace to any legitimate client, as business costs. He testified that when he'd raised concerns, he'd been told the company's financial advisor had reviewed and approved the arrangement. The advisor whose name had been cited was mine. He had kept records of those conversations. He passed them to Ms. Aldrin, who passed them to the judge. The room was very quiet after that. The final custody order came 6 weeks later, sole legal and physical custody to me. Sawyer received scheduled visitation under specific conditions and was ordered to pay child support. The amount was modest given the state of his finances, but the legal record mattered more to me than any number. The debt litigation took longer, months of depositions and documents, and one particularly grim afternoon where I sat across from my former father-in-law and watched him try to explain away 3 loan documents bearing my forged credentials. The settlement required liquidation, an investment property, a brokerage account his father had held for 30 years, and eventually the family home itself, the one with the manicured lawn and the 2-car garage that had always made visitors assume everything inside was equally well kept. I drove past it once after the for sale sign went up. I didn't slow down. Sawyer came to my apartment building on a Wednesday night in November. It was raining. I saw him on the security camera before I went downstairs. Standing in the vestibule in a jacket that wasn't quite waterproof, staring at his phone. He'd called 4 times that evening. I hadn't answered any of them. I went down because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. The version of him that existed when there was nothing left to perform for. He looked worse than I'd expected, and I'd expected bad. His face was drawn. His eyes were red in the way that could mean crying or could mean sleeplessness, probably both. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said, before I could speak. "Okay," I said. He stopped, started again. "I don't understand how things got this bad." "I know you don't," I said. "That's the problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked something I hadn't anticipated. "Did you ever actually love me? Like really?" I didn't answer right away because the question deserved something real. "Yes," I said, "for a long time, but I think I loved who I thought you were. And somewhere along the way, the person I thought you were and the person you actually were stopped overlapping." He nodded slowly, as though absorbing something he'd known for a while but hadn't let himself look at directly. "Is Josie okay?" he asked, and for the first time all evening his voice changed. Something in it went small and unguarded, the way voices do when people ask about the thing they actually care about underneath everything else. "She's great," I said. "She's really, really great." He nodded, hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. "I want to be better for her." "Then do that," I said. "Don't ask me to help you figure out how. Just do it." I went back inside before he could say anything else. The last time I saw his mother was at the grocery store on a Saturday morning in March. I was in the produce section with Josie, who was very seriously evaluating bananas, when I glanced up and saw her at the far end of the aisle. She looked older. She was dressed plainly, a cardigan, jeans, none of the careful presentation I had spent years standing next to. She saw me at the same moment. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she pushed her cart slowly toward me and stopped a few feet away. She looked at Josie for a long moment. "She's gotten so big," she said. "She has." There was a long pause. His mother looked down at the handle of her cart. "I was hard on you," she said finally. "I know that's not enough to say." "No," I agreed, "it isn't." She looked up. Her eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had been through a real reckoning, not a performance of one. "I thought I was protecting my son," she said. "I think I was just protecting an idea of him that was never real." I thought about that sentence. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say. I'm not looking for an apology, I told her, not harshly, just plainly. But Josie deserves grandparents who show up for her, not to play a role, actually show up. If that's something you're willing to do, the door isn't closed. She didn't say anything. I put my hand on Josie's shoulder and we moved on. Mama, Josie said, holding up 2 containers of strawberries with the focused authority of someone who takes this very seriously, which ones look better to you? I studied them with equal seriousness. I think that one, I said, pointing to the one in her left hand. She nodded, satisfied, and placed the other one back on the shelf. We walked the rest of the store like that, her making small, certain decisions, me pushing the cart and watching her. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles around you when the worst of something is finally over. It doesn't feel like winning, it just feels like space. Room to breathe. Room to be a person again, instead of a resource someone else is managing. People sometimes ask me if I regret the years I spent helping that family. The money, the late nights, over their books. The energy I poured into something that had been cracked long before I arrived. My answer is no, not because it didn't cost me, and not because I don't sometimes still feel the weight of what was taken, but because every one of those years led me to Josie, and I would do it all again for her. What I would not do again is disappear inside someone else's needs until I forgot I had my own. That Tuesday morning in the conference room, when I looked across the mahogany table and said what I said. That was the first morning. In 4 years, I remembered what it felt like to take up exactly the right amount of space in my own life. I'm still learning how to do that. Most days, I think I'm getting better at it. And on the mornings when I'm not sure, I have a 6-year-old who holds up 2 containers of strawberries and waits for my honest opinion. And somehow, that turns out to be exactly enough.